Hi everybody, my name is Mark. When I volunteer in the public schools, they call me Mr. Mark or Maestro Mark. And, especially when I've been volunteering in the library, I notice there are books that everybody seems to love these days. Books like Captain Underpants and there's the most popular books. And the new books are really good, but sometimes some of the old books are also good. And the book I'm sharing with you today was already 11 years old by the time I was born, and I am really old. You might recognize the drawing style because it's written by Monroe Leaf, but it's drawn by Robert Lawson. And what's called Wee Gillis, and it's from New York Review Children's Selections, thanks to them. And you may recognize the drawing style because it looks a lot like another book that Robert Lawson illustrated, a book about a certain bull. You know who I'm talking about. Wee Gillis. There he is. Now, Wee Gillis lived in Scotland. His mother's relations were all Lowlanders. They stayed down in the valleys and raised long-haired cows. His father's relations were all Highlanders. They stayed up in the hills and stalked stags, which is another word for following deer. Wee Gillis didn't know which he wanted to be, a Lowlander or a Highlander. His mother's relations all thought that his father's relations were very foolish to run around and climb and creep around the hills stalking stags. His father's relations all thought that his mother's relations were very silly to drive and call and milk their long-haired cows. Wee Gillis didn't know, but he watched both. And he was cheerful and amiable, which is a word that means friendly to everybody. So for 1 year, he went to live in the lowlands with his mother's relations. Every day he rose early and ate a large bowl of oatmeal, which they used to call porridge. Then he drove the long-haired cows out along the valleys, and at night he called and called them and drove them home again in time for his mother's relations to milk them. Once he was late in getting them home. Then the relations all asked him what had kept him, and he had to tell them that the cows wouldn't come when he called. Then the relations all said that he didn't shout loud enough, and that the cows couldn't hear him through the heavy mist. So every night, when the mist would come down over the valleys, Wee Gillis would shout a little louder than he had before. That was fine for his lungs, and by the end of the year, they were very, very strong. Can you see him calling for the cows in the mist? On the first day of the new year, Wee Gillis went up into the highlands. Every day he rose early and ate a large bowl of oatmeal, with his father's relations. Guess some things are the same in the highlands and the lowlands. Then he set out walking, crawling, running, and creeping all over the hills, stalking stags. He would hide behind thistles and sit on the heather, which here means low flowers. And sometimes he would have to be so quiet for hours at a time that you would have thought he was a stone. Once while he was stalking, he sighed a big sigh because he had stayed still for so long. And the noise that it made frightened a stag so that it ran away. Then the relations all told wee Gillis that he didn't keep quiet enough and that he must learn to hold his breath. So day after day, sitting among the thistles and on the heather, wee Gillis would hold his breath longer and longer to keep from sighing so he wouldn't frighten the stags. That was fine for his lungs, and by the end of the year, they were very, very strong. So year in and year out, wee Gillis would take turns calling the cows in the lowlands and stalking the stags in the highlands, and all the while his lungs grew stronger and stronger. Looks like he's getting bigger too, doesn't it? At last the day came when he must make up his mind and decide forever which to be, a Lowlander who called cows or a Highlander who stalked stags. Bright and early in the morning, there were 2 loud knocks on his door. When he opened it, there stood his Uncle Andrew from the lowlands and his Uncle Angus from the highlands. Gillis put on his kilt, and in a hurry, and away they went out into the morning. He's going to have to make a decision here, isn't he? Well, there's a lot of people who have family who live in one place and in another place. It's a really hard decision to make. They walked and walked, not saying a word, down through the valleys and up over the hills until they found just the right spot for deciding. Then his Uncle Andrew and his Uncle Angus stopped and stood very still. They turned to wee Gillis. He was exactly halfway up the side of the medium-sized hill, not in the lowlands and not in the highlands, just in the middle. And he had to choose forever. First, they pleaded and they begged very softly and very quietly, one at a time, and they politely waited for each to finish what he had to say before the other began. But wee Gillis still could not decide. So the uncles' voices grew louder and louder, and they didn't wait for each other to finish talking any more, but shouted and screamed and yelled until they jumped up and down and stamped their feet. You could hear them shouting all the way down in the valleys and all the way up in the hills. Suddenly his uncle stopped jumping and shouting because a very large man had come up behind them. He was carrying something brown and big, but he put it down beside a rock, and then he looked at wee Gillis, and then at Uncle Andrew, and then at Uncle Angus. When they were very, very quiet, he sat down on a rock. He picked up the brown thing that looked like a sack with sticks on it and took a deep breath and puffed his cheeks and shut his eyes and blew into one end of it with all his might. But nothing happened. He shook his head sadly and tried again, but nothing happened. And then he was very sad, and he said so. He was almost ready to cry, because he was a bagpiper, and he had just made these fine new bagpipes to play on, but he had made them too big, and he didn't have enough breath to blow them up.